Tim Box asked a question in my my Inside2 Facebook group about my wrist lift induction. The gist of it was that he's seen plenty of video demonstrations of it and had done it himself with success, but he wasn't quite sure if he was doing exactly what I was doing when I do my wrist lift, and so could I explain exactly what I was doing. And to be honest, the question stumped me, because I think hypnosis and hypnotism, and especially hypnotherapy, is very, very difficult to teach correctly. There are ways of teaching it which are easy, but I'm not sure that they're terribly correct. And so whilst it would have been easy for me to write back in answer to Tim's query and say, well, first of all, I tell the patient that, with their consent, I hope it's all right, it better be. I'm going to pick their hand up by the wrist like this, and that when I do, they mustn't help me lift it, and so on. I'd have been writing a procedure, a process. And the problem with that is, as with most things in hypnosis, I really don't think it's about the process, but the danger is that it's much easier to teach. You do this, then that, then something else. You go through a certain sequence of actions or activities in this order, and it will work. I remember the very, very first time I did hypnosis, it was because I read Valerie Austin's book on self-hypnosis at somebody else's request. And it said, say these words and it will work. I know that's not true. Just because you say the words, just because you do things in a certain order, does not mean it's going to work. There is more to it than that. But teaching the more to it is difficult. Teaching the more to it is difficult and complicated and time-consuming, and therefore expensive. And because it's difficult and complicated and time-consuming and expensive, it doesn't form a very good business model. Because given a choice as a student between a weekend course which is going to teach you to do things in a certain procedure and going to cost you £100, or maybe having to spend £5,000 to train over a year or two, people are going to spend the £100. And because of that, nobody's going to teach the 2-year £5,000 course, because there isn't going to be the demand for it. So you end up being left with, follow this process. And then everybody gets captivated by the process and focused on the process and forgets about the fact that there's somebody else involved. So, the wrist lift isn't just a question of, in a moment I'm going to pick your hand up by the wrist. When I do, don't help me lift it. I want you to find a spot on your hand that you can look at, and look at the spot. Whatever happens, just keep looking at the spot and let whatever happens happen. There's so much more to it than that. First of all, my patient's lying on the couch and sort of supine, and their hands are somewhere on their thighs or whatever. And when I go to start the wrist lift, I say, okay, with your consent, in a moment I'm going to pick your hand up by the wrist like this. Sometimes, when you go like that, the hand will go up almost magnetically. It doesn't always, it doesn't often, but sometimes it does. And when that happens, that's interesting, and you have to recognise it, and you have to take account of it, and you have to figure out what you're going to do with it. Mostly it stays on the lap or whatever, and you say, I'm going to pick your hand up by the wrist, don't help me lift it. Find a spot on your hand that you can look at while I do this sort of thing. Look at the spot, don't look anywhere else, just let whatever happens happen. And then you start. But to go back to Tim's original question, just briefly, he said he'd had some success with the wrist lift. Well, in that case, there's nothing else you need to know, because if it works, then you're doing something right, and it doesn't have to, in fact, it shouldn't be what I'm doing. You don't need to do Thain's wrist lift. You need to do Tim's wrist lift, or Fred's wrist lift, or Mary's wrist lift, not Thain's wrist lift. I remember there was a guy called Dr. Ken Sajek who used to publish a monthly or bi-monthly article online called Hypnosis, Your Questions Answered. And people would write in with all sorts of questions about hypnosis and hypnotherapy. And he would answer them, and I thought it was back at the end of the 1990s, beginning of the 2000s. And I thought he was brilliant. I didn't agree with everything he said, but I thought he was brilliant. And one of the questions was, how do you do Erickson's handshake? And Dr. Sajek's answer was, only Erickson could do Erickson's handshake. You have to learn how to do Barry's handshake, or John's handshake, or whatever. And the same is true of the now eponymously known, thanks for whoever was responsible for that, Thain's wrist lift. It isn't about Thain's wrist lift, and if whatever Tim or Tom or Fred or Harry is doing gets the person hypnotised, no amount of knowing what I'm doing is going to get them any more hypnotised. So, you know, do what you do, and if it works, fine. So this is for information only, really. Anyway, having said, I'm going to pick your hand up by the wrist. Don't help. Find a spot on my hand you can look at. Look at the spot, don't look anywhere else. Let whatever happens happen. I'll then start to lift it. Now, just several different things happen. I suppose 50% of the time the wrist feels normal, and you lift it and you move it about a bit, and you try and make sure that you do it in such a way that the patient can always see the spot that they've picked on their hand. And sometimes then you feel it go. You feel it click, something changes. And it feels like that you could let go and it's just going to stay there. That's probably maybe half the time, more or less. Sometimes, like I say, when you go to pick it up, the hand will rise up in it. You say, no, 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 don't help, don't help. And it's still, when you do it, it goes like that. Just stop, don't do it at all. Eventually you clamp your hand down on it so they can't move it. And then when you try to lift it up, there's just no weight in it at all. That's usually a good sign. I mean, you could just leave it and nothing's going to happen. When that happens, it happened with me last week with one patient. I put the hand back down again and I said, let's just see what happens if we do this. And I tied an imaginary piece of string around her wrist and then caught hold of the top of the string and went like that, and her hand moved up. And she was laughing. She couldn't believe what was happening. And that's one of the things, the signs where you know that it's real, where the patient themselves is genuinely astonished by what they're experiencing. That's a good sign, because you know that they're not pretending, they're not acting. Having done this piece of string thing, I then said, so what happens if, and I moved my chair back and I pointed at her wrist and did, well, you know, it's a good hypnotee. And so we carried on. You know, I told her she was a great hypnotee, that we could, you know, if it was all right with her subconscious, we were going to do some miraculous stuff here, and we did. So that was nice. So sometimes there's just no weight at all, and when that happens and I let go, then sometimes I'll go to town, probably in an unnecessary way, but say, in a moment I'm going to touch the back of your wrist like this. When I do, I want your subconscious mind to move your hand up towards your face. Your job is consciously to use all your willpower to stop that happening. In fact, try to put your hand down. The next time I touch the back of your hand like that, I want your subconscious mind to move your hand up towards your face. And your job, I'm not kidding, your job is really to try and make sure that does not happen. Do you understand me? Yes. Okay. And then it might take a moment, but after a little while, you see the hand go like that, and faster, and then you can do other things. Then you can say, speed it up if it's going too slowly, and when it touches her face, drop her into a very deep hypnotic trance, or whatever you want to do, or just keep it coming up until it touches my hand. Whatever, there's no right way, there's no one way to, it's not a process, it's about what feels right. Sometimes, when you go to pick the hand up, I mean, you've told them not to help you lift it. When you go to pick the hand up, it's like a dead weight. There's real resistance there. And then you say to the person, Are you resisting? Are you deliberately holding it down? Sometimes they'll say no. If their hand is, weighs a ton, and they're not deliberately doing that, that's telling you something too. There's something unusual, there's something different going on here. So, maybe you just have to hoik it up, or maybe you do something, and usually I would actually, I would struggle with it until I get it up there, and then see what happens. If you struggle to get it there and then you let go and it stays there, and you say to the person, are you holding it there? No. Am I holding it there? No, you're not holding it there, right? So there's something else going on here, isn't there? And they say yes, and you say go to sleep, and they go blue. You might do it that way. So exactly how you proceed with a wrist lift depends on the patient, not on the process. How you proceed with the wrist lift is down to what you notice even as you're going to pick their hand up. If it just stays still, if it moves, if it's really light, if it's normal, if it's heavy. You feel, sense. Some of the things you see, some of the things you feel, it's tactile. Some of the stuff you probably just see and feel, but in a weird way it ends up as though you're kind of sensing it in some other sort of way, which nobody could explain. But sometimes you just kind of feel. Like, for example, there was an occasion where I had this great wrist lift, and I knew the patient was a brilliant hypnotist, never worked with them before, knew they were great. I may have been grandstanding, shame on me, but that may have been the case. Anyway, when I touch your hand, it's going to rise up to your face. Your job is to stop it. And did that, and the hand started to go down. And I thought, bugger. And it went down and down and down. And how to explain this? A bit of me wanted to abort. This isn't working, I've said it's going to go up to your face, it's going down, this is a disaster. Another bit of me kind of felt, thought, knew, I can't explain it, I won't try to, that it was working, it just didn't look like it was working. Anyway, this person's hand went down and down and down and down and down until it got about half an inch above his lap. I think it was a guy. And then it stopped. And I hadn't said anything from touching the back of the wrist. It stopped. And stayed there for maybe 10 seconds, which is quite a long time when you're waiting for something to happen. And then it started to come up again, and it came up and up very slowly, up and up and up, all the way until it touched his face. Now, I might have been wrong when I thought I knew that it was working even though the hand was going down, but it felt like there was something going on other than the person just putting their hand down, because if they were just going to put their hand down, they'd have just put their hand down. And that wasn't happening, so there was something else happening here. I don't know what, but there was something else going on. Now, if you write out a step-by-step protocol, which says, first of all, you get permission to pick the person's hand up. Then you say, with your consent, I'm going to pick your hand up by the wrist. When I do, don't help me lift it. I want you to find a spot on your hand to look at, blah, 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 blah. Then, and you say, this is how you do the wrist lift. Then a large number of people are going to focus on pursuing that process to the end and assume that that's all that there is, when in fact the process is the least of it. And what I'm doing when I do the wrist lift, or any other induction, or any other protocol, or any other bit of hypnotherapy, is spending 90% of my mind, brain, whatever, focused on the patient or on the hypnotee and what they're doing, and whether or not I'm able to make any sense of that, rather than I work through this process and then I work through that process and I work through something else. Because the processional route to hypnosis and and hypnotherapy, I think, is a sort of halfway house between what I do, or what I prefer, which I think is almost entirely improvisational, and what people do when they're reading a script. A script is the apotheosis, really, of procedural, process-based hypnosis, process-based therapy. It's all about, this is how you do it, and you can completely ignore the patient. What they've got to say, what they feed back, what they tell you, either obviously by spelling things out to you in their words, or by their body language, or the weight of their wrist, or whatever, you ignore. So there's a scale, and in certain circumstances, scriptnosis is okay. I suppose in certain circumstances, following a process is okay. But what I'm doing when I do a wrist lift or a fingers induction or any other sort of induction is not just observing a procedure or a process. I know the process, and now I'm going to kind of maybe use that as a sort of basic framework and work within and without it. But there's another really important thing, which is that I know the wrist lift works. I mean, I've done it enough times when it hasn't worked, but I know it can work. I know the wrist lift works, and I know a lot of other people have just seen me doing wrist lifts in supervision sessions or on YouTube or wherever, and gone away and they've done the wrist lift and it's worked, and that's great. Part of the reason it works, I think, is because they've seen me do it, they've seen that it works when I do it, they believe in it, and because they believe in it, it works. And I think that's a big deal, actually. I remember when I was training, I was one of the inductions, one of the processes I was taught, and we were all taught on the course, was this one way where you get automatic movement of the hands. So you have the hands going one way and then another way, and then eventually it becomes automatic, and then you get the person hypnotised. I don't believe in that at all, and it would never work for me because I don't believe in it. It might work for other people who do believe in it, but I know it's never going to work for me because it's too much palaver. I don't see the sense in it. I don't see how it just doesn't do anything for me. And so a large part of making any induction work, I think, isn't that just that, or at all, that the patient knows you're a hypnotist or thinks you're a hypnotist or whatever. That can help. But I think it's really important that the hypnotist believes in their induction and has confidence in it. And obviously the more times you do it, and it works, then the easier it is to be confident in it. It isn't always going to work, it doesn't always work for me, but I know it works. I know me and it together, more times than not, will get the patient hypnotised. But that actual belief in what you're doing is just as important, more important than following any certain set of steps in the right order, the right process, and infinitely more important than knowing what I'm doing when I do a wrist lift. So there you go, Thain's wrist lift. That's what I'm thinking about, what I'm doing it when I do it. But you just have to play with it and see how you do your own wrist lift. Thanks. Bye bye.